Welcome, everybody, to Night at the Movies. This is a film podcast with Paul Miller and Leslie Heimbaugh. This is sort of our passion project here that we've been working on, and we've had a pretty good run so far of our first two episodes. Of course, they will always be available on our SoundCloud page as well as the YouTube channel for the Nightly News Media Club at Central Penn College. So I am Professor Paul Miller. I'm an assistant professor of media studies here at Central Penn College, and I'm also joined by Leslie Heimbaugh, who is getting very, very close to her bachelor's degree here, and she is, what is your title again?
I'm the development officer for Perry County Literacy Council.
But you're also extremely knowledgeable and passionate about films, and so that's why we wanted to get you here. And of course,
Sure.
Last time when we were here, we talked about how we got into films and why we were thinking about some of our experience with them when we were growing up and why we're such cinephiles at this point. So it made sense to try to do something like this. So how'd you think the first two podcasts turned out?
I thought they were great. My son just roared with laughter over some of the comments that each of us made. He just loved it. So yeah, quite a few people have said they've enjoyed listening to it.
We and again, I know my mom checked it out too, and of course she remembers some of those times that I was referring to. So
yeah.
Some good memories, some sort of sad memories,
Sure.
but all the same brings us to why we are such fans of movies today. Well, one of the things that we wanted to cover, so we've got quite a list, at least probably our first year covered in terms of what we're going to talk about on this show. But what we are going to cover today is the cinema industry and how we think that the pandemic is and has changed film, at least going to movies at the movie theater forever. And so we have a couple of articles. We have a look at some of the big films slated for release at this point. Now, I will say that when we are recording this, it has just been announced that, at least in Pennsylvania, where we are, at the end of the month, a lot of the capacity restrictions are going to be taken away. And the CDC just also came out and said that they recommend that if you've been vaccinated, that you don't necessarily have to wear masks, though in a crowded place, it's sort of interesting how they worded this. They still recommend it in a crowded place, which, of course, if a theater is at full capacity, it is. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how this is going to play out. Now, we are certainly not going to really talk about the nuance of the pandemic beyond it being in our rear view at this point, assuming that, June 1st, which is when this podcast is being released, and forward, that the capacity restrictions are not going to be a major concern moving forward.
Right.
So what I wanted to start talking about is there were a couple of articles that we looked at to get ready for this. And one was a New York Times article, and it talks, this is from March, so it's relatively recent, and it talks about some of the things that they feel in terms of how the film industry in the future is going to handle this. Now listen, obviously most major films have been pushed. A couple came out during the pandemic, certainly Tenet, which we'll mention, and we'll probably talk about that. And also Wonder Woman 1984 came out in theaters to a certain point, but streaming as well. And so I think that's kind of where I want to start talking about this here. So most, if not all, of the major film producers now have streaming services. And between the streaming services and on demand, most of the, I don't want to say smaller films, but lower budget films have now been released directly through there and through on demand. But many of the films also have been pushed, for entire years in some point.
Right.
So we were talking off air, Leslie, and we were talking about, and just sort of a teaser, our next episode will be about Christopher Nolan. So I kind of want to start here.
Yes.
You asked a question before we went on the air here about why Tenet ended up being released when it was. And I just kind of want to talk a little bit about that and sort of your thoughts about how and why you think that happened. Again, this is sheer conjecture at this point. But what was it about Tenet that the movie... See, again, regardless of what Chris Nolan wants, at the end of the day, he didn't take any money out of his pocket to make this movie.
No.
Warner Brothers took out $205 million, one of the largest budgets in film history. And so what is your thoughts on why it did get released when it did?
Well, it's a real head scratcher to me because I think it was exciting to have something to watch and to really look forward to. But at the same time, I saw it on a small screen, and I am positive it was not half the experience that it would have been in a theater with other people, and the size of the screen, and because technically it's a beautiful. I mean, it's complete eye candy as far as being interesting to see. And to me, it's kind of sad because I'm sure not as many people had access to it that would have it if it had been released in a non-pandemic era. But yeah, I really have mixed feelings about it. I think to me, it's a little sad because I think it could have been a real blockbuster. And now I'm afraid it's going to be washed up by the time we get out back to the movies, and people are going to say, well, that's past. I want to see what's coming out that's new.
One of the things certainly that I think you can attribute to this is that Nolan is a massive advocate for the cinema.
Sure.
He actually blasted Warner Brothers when they were talking about because they were originally going to do their hybrid, release it in the theater and release it on HBO Max, and I think it's really interesting from that perspective. Now, I did get to see it in the theater. I actually. And I talked about this a little bit last time, but down in York, there's a IMAX 3D theater that we go to quite frequently, and not the first weekend, but probably the second weekend that it opened, we went. And again, second weekend, huge blockbuster film. Again, understanding that there's capacity restrictions. There were probably maybe 10 or 15 people in the theater. Yeah. And honestly, Tenet only ended up doing about $50 million in the United States. Now, internationally, it did well. And I do believe that just based on the box office gate in the U.S. and internationally, that it did recoup its money. But obviously, you don't make films to break even.
Right.
Now, again, are we crying for Warner Brothers here?
No.
Probably not. Again, Nolan made them money hand over fist with the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yeah.
But it is really sad because this is a film that I believe is, and I don't mean to sort of spoil our next episode, but it's certainly one of Nolan's best.
Sure.
My contention is here, though, and I just want to bring up some research that I've done. So I am in my PhD program at IUP, and I took a course called Media Criticism this term, one of my favorite classes that I've ever taken. And we had to do a pretty sizable final project, about a 20-page paper. And so my contention was that this could be the end of the auteur film director in terms of a movie that enters into popular culture.
Right.
And so what I meant by that is that there's no way Nolan's ever going to get $200 million to play with ever again.
No.
And it's not his fault. Like,
right.
if the pandemic wouldn't have come, the movie would have been huge. But the problem was that so many people that saw this movie and reviewed this movie, even professional reviewers, talked about how it was too complicated,
right,
and it was too difficult to follow. And it's funny because, like, that an auteur director, that's what they do. It's art. Yeah. It's not this let's blow stuff up and have a retread plot that's been in every single Hollywood film for the last 30 years.
Exactly. He's a genius, but there's so much depth in all of his movies. And honestly, I'll say this in our next podcast too, but many of them do bear watching several times because you get a different layer from it every time you watch it. But I read an article in Variety magazine from April 2020 that said, here's the thing that's never happening again, and that is that major movies that they'll be exclusively reserved for theaters. As far as the future of cinema goes, I think we're gonna see a lot of these dual releases where you end up with movies that end up in both places.
But why? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't.
Because when you think about the business model of, I mean, this is part of what I teach in some of my classes. The business model for film is very, very strict.
Yeah.
You create the movie, it's out in theaters, it's released internationally, and then there's this sort of window. Maybe it kind of goes to smaller screens and the, sort of budget film houses that existed at one point. We can come right back to that. And then it goes to, your on demand, your DVD. Then it moves to things like maybe HBO. Then it moves to your TNT, TBS type things. And then finally, you might see it, on other places. But I think that that's what's really interesting is that it just doesn't make sense to me that these cinema, these film studios would do that. It almost seems like they're cannibalizing themselves.
It does.
And I just don't understand why they wouldn't want to go back to, or at least attempt to go back to the original business model. Now, I know that DVD is not what it once was.
Right.
But the number of subscribers on some of these platforms, the HBO Maxes and Disney Pluses, I still think it just is so surprising to me that they would want to continue with these dual release movies.
I read that actors, directors, people who score the movies, etc., all those people, when the films go to streaming platforms, they only earn 10 cents on the dollar, and they're really not happy with this idea unless it was crafted with that in mind. So yeah,
it just doesn't make sense to me. And again, my biggest contention in my paper was that I just don't think that auteur directors that are sort of out of really what my whole thing was about original movies.
Right.
I made the point that over the last, from 2015 to 2019, now I threw 2020 out for obvious reasons. From 2015 to 2019, I think there was only 6 movies that weren't in the top 20 of each year. So for 5 years, 20 movies, we're talking about 100 movies here. There were 6 that were original ideas.
Wow.
6. They were either sequels, they were retreads, remakes, reboots. Now, I did kind of sub out some of there was like 2 or 3 kids movies.
Yeah.
Because pretty much if you've got Disney behind you, or if you've got some of these major studios behind you, those movies are gonna do well. But in terms of movies that are more teen to adult, 6 movies. 2 of them were from Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
1 of them was from Nolan, and 1 of them was from Tarantino.
Yeah.
And it's pretty crazy when you think about it that all we get in Hollywood now is retread ideas.
Right.
In fact, Leslie, I have some of the movies here, and don't let me forget, I do want to go back to some of the theater closures as well. I have a list here of some of the big movies that are to be released this year. Tell me if you hear any new ideas here. There's, in May, Spiral from the Book of Saw. We've got Cruella. We've got The Conjuring. We've got Fast and Furious 9.
Oh, why are there 9 of them?
I actually don't mind the Fast and Furious movies, to be honest with you.
I'm sure they're fun.
They're fun. But again, you get what you get. You don't leave that theater thinking about anything. I mean, and again, I don't want to go back to Tenet because we talked about that, but that's a movie. I left that movie and I drove home and I'm sitting there still thinking about it. And when I got home, I went on Screen Rant and started watching some of the stuff that they were doing. I probably stayed up until probably 1, 2 in the morning just watching movies, trying to digest this movie. And that is what, for me, film is.
Me too.
And that's what frustrates me so much about what happened with Tenet, because they gave Nolan the center stage and this huge budget and this huge movie and all of this, and then people are trying to say that they didn't like it because you had to think too much.
Ugh.
Like, isn't that what art is about?
Yes.
I mean, that's what gets me. Here's a couple more. Peter Rabbit 2, Space Jam, A New Legacy. We've got The Suicide Squad. We've got, let's see what else we have here. Dune. We've got James Bond, No Time to Die. We have Addams Family 2. We have Ghostbusters, Afterlife, Top Gun, Maverick, Spider-Man, No Way Home, and The Matrix 4.
Yeah.
Was there one original movie in there?
Not one.
And so that's, again, the point that I'm trying to make. Originality is gone.
Yeah.
It's all about these big budget reboots because the movie studios, they want to make sure that they've got a built-in audience. And that's, to me, the bigger problem with film here.
I agree.
We can certainly talk about the issues with the theaters and theater closures and things like that. But to me, as film as an art is especially in the mainstream, is going away.
Well, and there's where you can identify one upside of the pandemic and movies, in that the small movies really got some exposure. I read, movies that we're accustomed lately to, the movies that are winning Oscars as being, many of them being movies no one's heard of. And I know I hear the people complain about that, but they should really give some of those movies a shot. But
why don't they?
I don't know. But the interesting thing was, it also meant big exposure for old movies that that people had never seen, because people were desperate for something to watch. But like the little independent films, like Andy Samberg's Palm Springs, it was it was actually like Tenet in that it was totally out of order, and it was basically like an amnesiac type story. But also this film called The Wretched, which was a teeny tiny little independent film. They released it in drive-ins and it made over $1 million. I mean, it wouldn't have made much at all. The pandemic made going to or seeing movies sort of like shopping local, in that you were supporting smaller independent businesses, which I think is sort of exciting.
To your point, Leslie, I think that it might have actually kind of sparked sort of a renaissance thing with drive-ins as well. And as you know, over the years, drive-ins have sort of gone by the wayside. We do still have one or two here. I don't even want to say locally, because even from where we're at, the closest one's probably 30, 45 minutes.
Right.
But I wonder if that, because of last summer, maybe we start seeing a bit more love for drive-ins.
Yeah, some nostalgic things like that. People rank the return to the movies right up there with celebrating holidays with family again and visiting with friends pre-pandemic. So it's an extremely important activity for Americans.
But again, and again, maybe it's not because maybe people weren't ready yet, but even in this New York Times article from Brooks Barnes that we talked about earlier, a movie called Raya and the Last Dragon, which was estimated $150 million, was released, only did $8.6 million in North America on their first week. So again, we were talking earlier off air about Ghostbusters Afterlife was originally supposed to come out in June. That's been pushed to November. I mean, I just am not sure how this is going to all turn out.
Yeah.
And I do think it does have something to do with comfort level.
Yeah.
In fact, when we went to see Tenet, now again, we're talking last summer here. When we went to see Tenet, I'd ask a few people if they wanted to go along, and people just weren't ready yet. And I wonder if maybe once we get to July 4th that people are ready to go back. But I wonder if it's ever something where in the back of our minds we're always just thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm sitting in a room with people without masks on, and there's 100 people or 200 people in this auditorium. And that being said, every theater I go to has to have good ventilation, because I mean the AC in there, man, it's kicking.
Yeah, well, with the I hope that some have used this time to improve, their ventilation, and the cost of going to the movies now is so crazy, and really as the cost has gone up, movie theaters have not really added all that much value to the experience. So, eventually something's going to have to give in that department too, because you're going to pay that much for a movie, you're going to want some amenities. Some theaters, yes, they're beautiful, but a lot of them are still crusty places where your feet stick to the floor.
When we went to see Tenet, it was like a whole new theater.
Yeah.
They pulled out all the seats, which they had nice seats in this one theater anyway, because it was the only IMAX theater. Now they've got the big, cushy, reclining leather seats. So I do think a lot of the theaters have tried to upgrade.
Yeah.
Now, here's my question. Have you been to any movies since this all started?
I have not.
Really?
But the honest truth is, other than Tenet, there really hasn't
been much.
Hasn't been anything that I was dying to go to the
I was dying to see Tenet.
Well-
I couldn't go without seeing it in the theater. I'm so glad I did.
Yeah. And frankly, paying $20 for a movie at home when I have my dogs climbing on me and my kids, interrupting, saying, "What did they say?" And, it's hard for me to drop the 20 when it's not going to be anything like going to the theater.
I miss it so much.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to seeing some of these films. Again, not that they're necessarily my cup of tea or that it's anything to write home about, but some of these movies I'm really, really looking forward to. But again, I still think that based on, now again, we're talking 2+ months ago when this article came out. But again, $150 million to make, $8.6 million on its first weekend. Even a film like Tom and Jerry, which cost around $80 million to make, actually did pretty well. They got some good numbers coming in for that. Again, a kids movie, but I think that it's at least a sign. I wonder, to me, I think the big one coming up is Fast and the Furious 9 on June 25th.
Yeah.
I think that we are going to get a much better sense of what is going to happen at the cinema. But again, what happens, Leslie, if the cinema now is just big budget action movies, which is what I think is going to end up happening?
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I need them to keep bringing the art films in. I need just reserve a couple theaters for that, and run your other ones as much as you want. I love Midtown Cinema.
I was just going to say that.
I often go there. I try to support them whenever I can because it's a beautiful place to go see a movie, and I haven't even been there to see the renovations to it yet.
Oh, we have got to go. So again, what theaters have had to change. They've had to adapt. And some of the theaters were doing, you could rent out the whole theater. And I know my daughter went to one of those. And it's good to know that they were at least giving it a shot.
Sure.
But again, what are these theaters going to do? And again, it's tough to cry for, massive corporations.
Right.
But at the same time, cinema has been such a fabric of our society for
Right.
over 100 years.
Yeah.
And it's just not the same to watch it at home. I don't care how big your TV is. I don't care how good your surround sound is. It's just not the same.
This Jordan Crucchiola of Wired said that this quote just resonates with me. A chance to be immersed in going to the movies is a chance to be immersed in a world of fantasy, to laugh and scream with strangers, to learn more about what it is to be human, all without the distractions of outside life.
And I think it's also something to be said about phones. Like when you're at your home,
Oh, yeah.
you're on your phone. I mean, for the most part, even if you make a conscious effort to put it away, or if you get a notification or something, you don't do that when you're at the movies. I mean, I know, of course, there's bad seeds in every crowd.
Sure.
But I know for me, like my phone's away and I don't touch it.
Yeah.
But when you're at home, it's almost like you have a different thought process. And even for me, I know that when I'm at the theater, I'm not going to be on my phone.
Right.
Unless like somebody's calling me like 15 times in a row or I
Yeah.
have to step out to go to the bathroom. But that being said, like I just can't imagine anyone who's a fan of film would rather watch the movie at home
No.
rather than going to the theater.
No, and if I think it's going to take some innovation on movie theaters' part. There's other industries are innovating things. The experiences are getting better, and I think theaters they really can't do business as usual anymore. It's going to I don't know what the innovations are personally, but I think we're going to have to find some new things to do.
I wonder if, and again, so I also wanted to talk about a article called "Can Cinema Recover from a Year of Lockdown" by Victor Stiff. He is saying that he believes that some of these smaller movies are going to go direct to streaming, but he also makes a note that basically he says the pandemic did force Hollywood to postpone some of its most lucrative franchises. A big budget title like Fast and Furious 9 can't recoup its cost without earning revenue from theaters.
Yes.
The industry managed to churn out hundreds of small and mid-budget films because these titles can turn a profit without a theatrical run. That being said, how do you balance that? I mean, when you think about places like the Midtown Cinema, or even just any theater, there's always, your sort of art type movies, or maybe from more auteur directors that aren't super big budget, like Tarantino's Once Upon a Time or things like that do get play in theaters for an extended period of time. But some of the smaller films that are often up for Oscars and things like that, don't really get a whole lot of play in your average cinema.
Yeah, it's tough. It's the advertising and everything that goes into it that makes you want to see those movies. Again, I think this is where directors, actors are going to have to put some skin in the game. They're going to have to, convince us that we need to see these movies, and they're going to help, subsidize some of it, I think. They're going to have to put their money where their mouth is, let's say.
I guess I don't understand in this particular case why we haven't seen more from the... In fact, we were talking off air, Christopher Nolan basically came out and said, listen, why can't some of these huge movie studios help prop up? And he actually, penned an op-ed in Washington Post asking for Congress to help some of these struggling theaters because of how it's such a fabric in our society. But, why can't some of these big movie studios help some of these struggling theaters? And we keep coming back to the same thing. It makes no sense to me why these companies, why these movie studios would want to release them in the theater and at home at the same time. It doesn't make any sense to me from a business perspective, from an art perspective. I don't get it. I think maybe they made the decision too soon. Well,
and it's interesting. I read, and this is from a 2020 article also, but Amazon and Netflix are looking at buying theater chains, because obviously they've figured out, I hate everything being gobbled up by these giant behemoths, but they have figured out how to make money and how to keep things rolling. So I don't know if that will help us either. But, you said about supporting theaters, these are individual human beings, human lives that are being affected, and all the lower pay people that work on a film, the grips and the minor sound people, and they're trying to make a living too. And so it's not just paying big bucks for the star power. It's it's employment in our country. It's a huge source. So we got to do something.
I wonder. I want to kind of move to the next segment because I think that we've covered this pretty well. Do you believe that movies are going to be more spread out across the board in terms of production? So I guess let me rephrase my question. Do you think some maybe major Hollywood players, instead of working through the studio system because maybe Christopher Nolan can't get greenlit for what he wants to do you think he starts maybe producing movies? Do you think that maybe instead of working with a Warner Brothers, he kind of goes out on his own and kind of does his own thing?
Well, he's that's how he got Memento made, was really he had to shop it around like crazy. And I think now he's going to become irresistible to people, even though they say they're not going to give him money. He's going to find money and keep moving forward. I mean, I think that's what's going to have to happen. And, again, the money is... It's so sad that that's what makes everything tick, but you can't get people interested unless they're going to make money on it. I can understand the need to break even or make a living, but you don't. I mean, how much money do you really need?
Well, the film studios apparently need lots of money. And this is where I wonder where people like Tarantino and Nolan come in. And again, we're using these two, but certainly other auteur filmmakers like Spike Lee and the Coen brothers all have something to say here because they already have built-in audiences. Now, it's not to say that people like Spike Lee or the Coen brothers are asking for $50, $60, $70 million budgets, but they do have enough of a following at this point that maybe if they start trying to put out some more films, maybe those are the individuals that keep the art house alive.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's, again, sort of what I was talking about in my paper. Like, are these auteur directors now relegated to the art house? Like, well, the big studios aren't going to give us the money that they used to because they want a retread idea.
Yeah.
And that is where I am the most worried about film. And honestly, this is pandemic aside.
Yeah.
So when we think about the pandemic aside, my concern is that people, in a general sense, don't want new ideas. They want to go to the theater, knowing what to expect, get what they expect, and walk out with a smile on their face, as opposed to, going in, seeing something that's kind of out of the ordinary or different. And that's my bigger concern, that the mass public doesn't want that.
Yeah.
They want Avengers 15.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
And that's what's frustrating to me at this point. And again, this is sort of aside from the pandemic. Like, what has happened to us as a society where that's what we expect from film?
Yeah, we're studying it in our evolution, in the evolution of social media class, the McDonaldization of the world. And basically, it's so easy, it's so fast, it's so mindless, and it's cheap. And that's what people want. The cheap part they're not getting if they go to the movies. But it just makes me sad, too, because I think when I coax somebody in my house that's reluctant to watch a movie that I think has a lot of depth, they never walk away and say, man, what a waste of time. Because that's the kind of excitement you'd like to generate around the world, is that, that passion for seeing something that you haven't seen 50,000 times done a way that really tugs at your heartstrings or really surprises you. That's the joy of going to the movies to me.
And I just don't understand why and when we got away from this. Like, I understand that the blockbusters have always been a thing since the 70s, since Jaws really kind of broke that mold of blockbuster films. But why? I just don't, I can't point to one particular time to say, wow, this is when we went from like being open-minded to things to, but then again, is it the public's fault or is it the movie studio's fault?
Yeah.
Because instead of taking a chance on something like Tenet, and again, they did take a chance on Tenet, but instead of taking a chance on more things like Tenet, unique ideas from fantastic filmmakers, instead, again, you heard me read the list of blockbuster movies that are coming out this year. All retreads. Again, not to say that I'm not interested in some of them, and I'll probably see many of them.
Sure.
But at the same time, they're not going to resonate with me. Okay, I'll go to the theater. I'll enjoy them. Hey, that was a good movie. Maybe I'll watch it again when it comes out on streaming, that I don't have to pay for it. But that's what gets me, is I just don't understand when movie studios said to themselves, well, we're not going to give a filmmaker money unless it's an idea with a guaranteed audience.
Exactly. I read that sales of movies had a nice high in 2018, but movie sales peaked back in 2002. And think about it, we were a lot less polarized then. We were, I think, I'd venture to say, a little more thoughtful about things then. So I don't know if our closed-mindedness in society is the other thing too. You cannot deny the cost of a movie. It's really tough to take a chance, especially if you're taking your family on a bummer, a movie that stinks, and you've just dropped, $50 on tickets and more for snacks, and the theaters are making their money on the snacks. They get very little from the film. So I think too that people who would like a certain kind of movie they're drawn to it because they know they're going to get the kicks that they're after. They like seeing stuff blown up. They like seeing car chases. Lots of fighting and things like that. I guess that's the kind of thing they're after if it's deemed a sure thing.
I'd also mention, and I think that maybe we're a little past this, but one of the things that some of the communication theorists over the years have talked about is sort of standardization in terms of a global audience. That movies that we think are maybe a little bit more complicated or thought-provoking, at least, don't necessarily transfer globally. Mm-hmm. So that one of the reasons, because film over the last 30 years has become such a global market, that the movie studios are making these exact types of movies because they know that they're going to be guaranteed for a global audience. Yeah. And I wonder if that also plays into it. As I mentioned, Tenet did extremely well globally, even though it was from an auteur filmmaker, maybe a little bit more
Yeah.
complex than your average retread. But that's what, to me, I think is also worth noting, is
Yeah.
that because all these studios are so global now and thinking about a global audience, that might play into it as well. But I think this is something that's really only been going on for the past 10 years or
Yeah.
so.
Well, you've talked about too how it's shocking how much money these movies make overseas. It's the America does not have the market cornered on movies, and making money.
Interestingly enough, I was just reading that 2019, I believe, was the first time, or might have even been last year, was the first time that international box office reached over the U.S.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, now it almost seems like these studios are maybe not even focusing on a U.S. audience and
Right.
more focusing on the international market.
Right. And to back up a tiny bit, the other thing that I think is having an effect on all media is the sheer volume of media that's out there. How many times do you look at Netflix and think, spend an hour figuring out what you want to watch, because there's so many choices. And if you're going to sink the time in, you don't want to waste it on something stupid. And I think, too, media is coming at us from every angle. And there's really no filter that says this is worth your time, this isn't. I think it's kind of interesting when you look at it that way.
You bring up a really interesting point that hadn't occurred to me till you just said that. Do you think that, and I will say that a lot of really cool, unique projects have been coming out on television, whether it's through streaming platforms or even, premium cable. That's where a lot of the new stuff is coming out.
Right.
And I'd also say that because of the production quality on many of these shows,
Sure.
it's equal to film.
Yeah.
And so it almost seems like these big movie studios, any new ideas that they have are kind of relegated to television anyway.
It's not as risky.
Right. And then the big budget stuff goes to the cinema. So maybe there is hope for original ideas out there through television.
Yeah.
And that hadn't really occurred to me until you brought that up, Leslie.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
Well, it's
that.
so cheap to get Netflix. What is it, $10 a month or $12 a month or something like that? And I'm not saying it's all great, because I've watched a few documentaries that were heavily in need of an editor. They went on for way too long. But they can do that, and then you can opt in or opt out, and you really have nothing lost if you decide you're not going to keep going.
That's so interesting. I think you're onto something there. I wonder though what impact long term that has on the film industry, because if all we're going to do is keep remaking the same stuff, sooner or later we're going to run out of ideas to remake 50,000 times.
Well, again, there comes the innovation, because we have got to figure out what do we want from this? What's the outcome we're looking for? And if all people want are the big budget blockbuster action films, I don't see how we're going to get anything different if we don't demand it.
Well, but that's the thing. How can you demand it if they're not offering you anything otherwise?
It's true.
And that's what's interesting here. I will say that there are some opportunities, like The Quiet Place. Again, I know it's a retread,
Yeah.
Quiet Place Part 2, but there's a movie to me that I think has a shot if we are going to get anything of any type of merit coming out. That movie's going to be good to take a look at. And there's a lot of other movies. Of course, I didn't go through every single film that's coming out, but at the end, I think that there's still some quality films coming out, not super high budget. I really think that this year could be sort of the path of divergence. So either we realize that all that we're going to get from now on is retreads, or maybe there is still an opportunity for some of these non-blockbuster films to have a significant impact.
Right.
Well, I do want to just end the show today with, is there anything that you're looking forward to, even if it is a retread?
Oh, yeah.
I know we've been slamming, not coming up with original ideas this entire show, but is there anything you're looking forward to this summer?
There are two retreads I'm curious about. I'm really curious about Cruella, because I think that it looks really fun to me. I like when Disney goes dark. I really do. And then because I'm a huge Timothée Chalamet fan, I really would like to see what he does with what they do with Dune. And then finally, there's an untitled Paul Thomas Anderson movie. He's one of my favorite directors. I would watch anything. I would watch him make toast because I love his movies so much.
He's never one I really got into, but I saw that too. That's actually slated currently to come out on Wednesday, December 22nd. I'd mentioned to you, December is going to be huge for film. You've got West Side Story on December 10th, Spider-Man December 17th, Matrix 4 December 22nd. You've also got Hotel Transylvania 4, Downton Abbey 2, and then the as yet untitled Paul Thomas Anderson movie. I mean, that is going to be pretty interesting. You gotta wonder, though, obviously we understand that this pandemic is kind of at bay.
Yeah.
Don't you think that if you do any looking back at the Spanish flu, there were 3 waves. Mm-hmm. We've been through 2.
Right.
The final wave that they went through was the following year, November, December, January.
Ugh.
And so now, hopefully, vaccination goes up, things like that. Hopefully that doesn't happen. That's my only concern. So we're looking forward to all these films in the wintertime, and I'm surprised that maybe these films aren't done yet. Maybe that's why they're not coming out till then. But, I was reading last night, some of these movies have been in the can for a year or more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll tell you what, I promise you, we'll get together for that Paul Thomas Anderson movie. I'll check that out with you as well.
That would be great.
There's a couple I'm looking forward to. Certainly, if you've listened to the second episode of the podcast, I'm such a big Ghostbusters fan.
Yeah.
And so here is the film that they have been trying to make since 1989.
Right.
I mean, they've gotten most of the originals back together. Now, they're only smaller components of this. They're not main characters or anything, but they're going to be in a considerable amount. So I'm really interested, especially after. And we talked about the most recent Ghostbusters, but generally considered a flop.
Yeah.
Financially, from reviewers, things like that, generally considered a flop. I'm really interested to see what happens here because
me too.
I kind of hope that they continue doing the Ghostbusters films. They're fun. Again, nothing to necessarily write home about, but still, again, some fun. And of course, I'm interested in like the new Space Jam and things like that with LeBron. I mean, I remember seeing that when I was younger. I mean, even when the original came out, I think I was 15 or 16, and I just loved that. I thought it was so fun, and I think it's cool because most kids don't really resonate with Looney Tunes anymore.
No.
They don't even know who they are.
No, especially millennials. I mean, and they're so politically incorrect that they can't even tolerate them anymore.
So, well, I will say, and I just want to give my final thoughts here, I think 2021 is everything for theaters.
Yeah.
I think that if we can't figure out a way as a society to support a wide variety of movies, I'm talking blockbusters and sort of, a little bit lower budget movies, that we are going to be experiencing in-home streaming of films for the rest of our lives. I really think this is a make or break year.
Yeah.
And I think that if things don't go the way that they are anticipated, I think that there's a lot of big things on the horizon. We've already seen a ton of theaters already close, some of the smaller ones. And maybe there were just too many. I mean, even just in the Harrisburg area alone, within a 30-mile radius, you're talking about 10, 15 theaters at one point, even 5 years ago. So maybe that was, I hate to say needed, but maybe it was.
Yeah.
Maybe some of your twins or some of the, sort of where they're showing retread films, they may not make it. And I'm not saying I think that that's a good thing.
Right.
I'm just saying that maybe oversaturation in the area. But in the end, I just can't imagine living in a world where I can't go to the movies on a Friday night.
Well, and I just refuse to believe it's over for movies. The death of the cinema has been predicted so many times. When TVs became popular in the 50s, everyone thought movies would die, and video cassettes in the 80s, and so on and so on. It's still going. I think, like I said before, innovation is going to be key. They've got to figure out some interesting ways to get us back and keep us there.
Well, maybe you should go talk to some of these and pitch them some of your ideas, because I'm sure they're looking for some.
I wish they would listen to me, yeah.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode number 3 of Nights at the Movies. It's always my pleasure to join you here, Leslie. Thank you very much for your time.
I loved it.
All right. Well, for Leslie Heimbaugh and for Paul Miller, we will see you again next time on Nights at the Movies.